They say America's backwoods hold secrets older than the nation itself, forgotten trails, collapsed cabins, and names that never made it onto paper. But some stories, some families, were buried not out of neglect, but out of shame, hidden away in the cracks of rural isolation, where no roads led and no outsiders ever came. This is the story of one such family. A bloodline twisted in on itself, where brothers became fathers, sisters became mothers, and children were born with the weight of generations of silence pressing down on their fragile bodies. Imagine a place so cut off from the world that the only voices you'd ever hear were your own kin. No new faces, no fresh names, just the same blood running thinner with each passing decade. To most people, this sounds like a nightmare, something that couldn't exist outside of rumor, but for one family, it was life, and it became their curse. The photographs that survive are hard to look at, faces marked by features that don't quite fit together, jaws that never grew straight, eyes that wandered in opposite directions. There's something unsettling in them, not because of cruelty or violence, but because you see what happens when nature is trapped in a cage of repetition. These children, these parents, these grandparents, they weren't monsters. They were human beings born into a fate they never chose. But to look at them is to glimpse what humanity tries so desperately to turn away from. And what makes this story worse is not just the deformities, not just the brokenness written across bone and blood. It's the silence. For years they lived unseen, unheard, tucked away in valleys no stranger dared to wander. The people nearby whispered about them, warned children never to stray too far into the woods. But nobody ever came to help. Nobody ever came to break the chain. This was America's forgotten family, bound by secrecy and condemned by isolation. As we pull back the layers of their history, we'll find a truth both heartbreaking and horrifying. Because this isn't just a story about genetics. It's about what happens when an entire family becomes a world unto itself. And once you enter their world, you'll understand why so many wished it had remained hidden forever. The family's origins trace back to a time when America was still carving itself out of wilderness. Settlers moved into the valleys and hollows of Appalachia, fleeing cities, fleeing rules, fleeing the gaze of others. In those places where the soil was poor and the roads were nothing but deer trails, families survived by holding tight to what little they had. And sometimes, what they had was only each other. In the beginning, there was nothing unusual. A husband, a wife, children growing in log cabins built from hand-hewn timber. But as the years wore on, neighbors drifted away. Land became abandoned. Communities shrank until the family looked around and realized there were no outsiders left. They lived in a valley of their own, and the only people left to marry were blood. At first, perhaps it was spoken about in hushed tones. A cousin marrying a cousin, a nephew becoming a son-in-law. But in isolation, what begins as a choice soon becomes the only path forward. The world outside kept moving, building railroads and towns, yet this family's world grew smaller with every birth, and every generation the faces began to change, the jawlines narrowed, the foreheads broadened, the eyes lost their symmetry. To the family, this was normal. To outsiders who would stumble across them, it was a sight that could not be forgotten. There are stories of travelers lost on hunting trips, stumbling onto cabins hidden deep in the brush. They spoke of voices that didn't sound quite right, slurred words, phrases that felt half-formed. They spoke of children who stared from behind trees, their eyes not aligning, their movements strangely stiff, as if their bodies were working against themselves. No records were kept, no names written down, only the memory of something eerie and unplaceable. In truth, what makes this tale so haunting is not just the biology, it's the way a family can invisible. How poverty, remoteness, and silence can weave together a net no one ever escapes. These people were not villains, they were prisoners of geography and blood. The forest walls that shielded them from the outside world became their cage. Generation by generation, the cage grew tighter. And yet, even in their seclusion, they left traces, whispers, Warnings, photographs that surface decades later, like ghosts crawling out of history. And every time someone looks at those images, they feel the same shiver. This should not have happened, and yet it did, right here on American soil. As the decades dragged forward, what began as whispers turned into legends. Locals called them strange, cursed, even monstrous. Children growing up in nearby towns were told to never wander into the woods where the family lived, as if stepping too close would let the curse pass into their blood. But behind those cruel words was something darker, a truth people did not want to face. It wasn't witchcraft, it wasn't some supernatural curse, it was isolation and the human cost of being left behind. Visitors who dared to approach recalled the silence first. No laughter of children, no sounds of daily life, only the creak of boards and the rustle of leaves. The cabins were crude, patched with tin and broken wood, leaning into the earth like they were trying to sink back into it. Inside, life was even starker. Mattresses stained with decades of use, food scraps left to rot, and people whose faces bore the unmistakable imprint of a closed gene pool. Some could hardly speak, communicating instead in grunts or gestures. Others stared at strangers with wide, unblinking eyes, their expressions unreadable, unsettling. The deformities were undeniable, chins that jutted too far or not at all, ears bent into unnatural folds, limbs twisted or weak. The children often grew into adults who never left the shadow of their family's land, unable to work, unable to function in a world that required more than their bodies could give. Their lives were short, marked by illness, hunger, and an unshakable dependency on each other. And yet, beneath the haunting images lies something even more disturbing. No one came. Decade after decade, the outside world chose not to see them. Authorities ignored them, neighbors whispered but stayed away, and the family sank deeper into their own bloodline. This was not just a failure of nature, it was a failure of society, a story erased because it was easier to let them suffer unseen than to intervene. The cruelty wasn't in their existence, the cruelty was in the way they were left to exist alone. To stare at their faces in old photographs is to stare at the consequence of abandonment. They were more than a family. They were a mirror, reflecting back what happens when humanity looks away from its own. By the mid-20th century, when America was racing toward modernity with highways, televisions, and suburban sprawl, this family was still locked in the same cycle that had begun generations before. The outside world only occasionally stumbled upon them, and when it did, the encounters were rarely written down, except as rumors whispered in gas stations and roadside diners. Travelers spoke of seeing figures lurking in the tree line, people whose movements seemed unnatural, whose eyes followed with an intensity that left them uneasy long after they'd driven away. There are accounts, half legend, half memory, of lawmen sent to investigate reports of children not attending school, only to return silent, shaken, unwilling to discuss what they had seen. Some hinted at homes where siblings lived as husband and wife, where children called both brother and son, sister and mother. The confusion of bloodlines created something beyond comprehension, something the outside world didn't want to untangle. For those who lived in nearby towns, the family became an open secret. Everyone knew of them, yet no one dared to go near. Their land was avoided, spoken about in low voices. At night, young men sometimes dared each other to drive past the edge of their valley, to see if they could catch a glimpse. Most came back pale, swearing they saw shadows moving in the dark, figures too deformed to be mistaken for anything else. The family was both feared and pitied, but never helped. In photographs that have surfaced, you see the truth that words often soften. Children with hollow eyes, their bodies thin, their skin pallid. Adults who look decades older than they were, their faces marked by hardship, their expressions caught between blankness and sorrow. In their gaze you see something haunting, not just suffering, but the quiet knowledge that there was no escape. The world had passed them by. This was no longer just a family hidden in the woods. By this point they had become something else entirely, a symbol of what happens when people are left to decay in silence. Theirs was not just a private tragedy. It was a collective one, carried by every person who chose to whisper instead of act, who preferred the comfort of rumors to the discomfort of intervention. And the deeper you dig into their history, the more you realize this was not an accident. It was a wound America allowed to fester, buried out of sight. And here is where the horror sharpens, not in violence, but in the everyday existence they endured. To live in that valley was to live without future. Children were born already carrying the weight of broken genetics, their bodies frail, their minds clouded, their voices struggling to form words. The cycle did not just repeat, it deepened, each generation more fragile than the last. Neighbors, if they ever drew close, told of hearing strange noises from the woods. Not conversations, not songs, but guttural sounds, animal-like grunts, echoing between the trees. Outsiders who entered the family's world described it as stepping into a place where time itself had collapsed, where humanity had thinned to its barest edge. And yet, there was no malice in them. They weren't predators. They weren't villains. They were survivors of a system that had forgotten them, a lineage collapsing under the weight of its own isolation. By the 1970s, when the world beyond them was marching into an age of modern science and medicine, their valley remained untouched, almost medieval. The cabins sagged into the earth, floors rotted, roofs caved, yet the family endured within. Their faces were still their own, but they bore the unmistakable fingerprints of inbreeding, wandering eyes, slack jaws, twisted expressions frozen into something that looked halfway between childlike and ancient. The rare researcher, journalist, or investigator who crossed their path often described a sensation difficult to put into words, the feeling that you weren't supposed to be there, that you were witnessing something that should not exist in the modern world. To look into their faces was to see history's mistakes made flesh. It forced a question most people cannot bear to ask. What would happen to you, to your children, if the world sealed you off and never came back? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed, resigned to the only life you knew? Or would you have tried to break free, even if it meant walking into a world that feared and rejected you? These are not easy questions, and that's why this family still haunts the edges of American memory. They were not simply a curiosity. They were a living reminder that isolation can warp not just the body but the spirit, and that sometimes the greatest horror lies not in violence, but in being utterly forgotten. The deeper one studies this family, the clearer it becomes that their tragedy was never just about blood. It was about abandonment. America, a nation that prides itself on progress, allowed them to remain trapped in conditions that belonged to centuries past. The dirt paths that led into their valley could have been lifelines. Instead, they became walls, ensuring that no teacher, no doctor, no savior would ever arrive. Those who saw them up close often left with nightmares, not because the family was dangerous, but because they exposed a truth most people cannot bear to face. We like to believe deformity and suffering belong to other times, other places, that such things could not happen here, not in the land of opportunity. But there they were, children born into bodies they could not escape, mothers who bore both siblings and sons, fathers who were also uncles. The family tree twisted into a circle, and inside it, the lives of flesh and blood human beings became a living archive of neglect. When outsiders finally documented them, through grainy photographs, through reports written with a mixture of pity and revulsion, the damage had already been done. Generations had passed with no intervention, and the family's very existence had become something of a macabre attraction. Researchers came not to save them, but to study them, as though they were specimens. Their suffering became a story whispered about in classrooms and written about in sensational articles, but rarely treated with the dignity of human tragedy. And perhaps that is the darkest truth of all. This was not just a story of one family's collapse. It was a reflection of how society consumes suffering. People looked at them and saw horror, fascination, even entertainment. but very few saw them as what they truly were. People born into a prison not of their own making, people who lived and died within a cycle that only outsiders could have broken. Their story lingers today not because of who they were, but because of what they reveal about us. We chose to turn them into legend rather than face the responsibility of their reality. And in doing so, we showed that the line between human history and human cruelty is far thinner than we like to admit. What remains of their story now exists in fragments, faded photographs, second-hand accounts, and whispers passed down through generations of people who lived nearby. Their valley has grown quieter. The cabins have mostly collapsed, swallowed by weeds and rot. Nature has begun to erase the evidence, covering the scars as if to hide the shame of what happened there. But photographs survive, and once you see them, you cannot forget them. The faces stare back through time, not with anger, not with joy, but with a vacant kind of sorrow. They are reminders that the world can forget you while you are still alive. Some say a few members of the bloodline escaped, drifting into nearby towns, marrying outsiders, disappearing into anonymity. Their children, perhaps, carried pieces of the past without even knowing. Others believe the family never truly escaped at all, that the line withered in silence, consumed by the very isolation that defined it. Either way, their valley remains a graveyard of a legacy most would rather not remember. And yet, their story matters, because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that progress is not guaranteed. For every city that rose, for every highway built, there were pockets of people left behind, sealed away in time, condemned by circumstance. This family became a living monument to that failure. Their faces, their voices, their broken lives, all of it speaks louder than any history book. When you look at them, you don't just see deformity. You see echoes of neglect, abandonment, and the cost of being forgotten. You see what happens when isolation festers for too long, when silence replaces compassion, when whispers take the place of help. This is not just their tragedy, it is ours too, because we allowed it to unfold in the shadows of our own country. The most inbred family that lived in total isolation is not simply a disturbing footnote in American history. It is a mirror, a reflection of what happens when humanity closes its eyes to suffering. And though their cabins are gone, though their names may never be spoken, their story will continue to haunt us, because the truth is simple, and it is terrible. They were forgotten once, and we are remembering them now, but only in remembering can we decide whether to repeat that silence or to finally learn from it.